If you need a previous one, please email me and I can send it to you. And there's also a questionnaire that will be sent after the workshop as well. And again, this is our nonprofit series, annual series we do every year, 2023, and Trends in Grant Writing. Coastal States Bank is our sponsor. We are thrilled to have them helping us. And let's see, we are going to get started now. And I'm going to hand it over and let our presenters introduce themselves. So who wants to get started here?
I can start. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristin Dubrowski. I'm the CEO of Hopeful Horizons. We're the local children's advocacy, domestic violence, and rape crisis service organization. And I've been in executive leadership and have done grant writing for a long time, over 15 years. So looking forward to talking with you all today.
Great, thank you. Chrystie, you want to go next?
Hi there, I'm Chrystie Turner. I'm Executive Vice President of the United Way, and the United Way is focusing on education, health, excuse me, and economic mobility.
Great. And then Mark, I'll hand it over to you, and then you can continue the slide presentation from there.
Perfect. Unfortunately, the neighborhood yard crew has decided to go through right as we're talking. So if you hear leaf blowers in the background, my apology. Mark Vanderpool. I am a independent grant consultant. Also have been doing that for about 15 years now. Live and work in Beaufort, although many of my clients are kind of across several states at this point. I trained originally in Tennessee, so I have a number of clients there as well. What we're hoping to do today is kind of be primarily a panel for questions. But before we dive into that, since we did promise this would be about trends, I just went ahead and created a slide with some of the trends that I've noticed over the past year or so. And I'll kind of walk you through those, although you will get a copy of the slides, so you don't have to be taking notes or memorizing anything here. But then I'll open it up, and if Kristin or Chrystie have anything that they would like to add that they've noticed, we'll start there and start taking questions after that. So the first one here, thing that I've noticed is that the applications are becoming more and more online, which makes me happy personally. Means no more 4:30 p.m. runs to the post office to get things postmarked, or runs to FedEx and the cost of FedExing things. You don't have to make 6 copies of the application and separate them with different color paper. I mean, it used to be crazy. So that's all good news. Bad news, neutral news, that now instead of having page limits, you're dealing more with word and character limits. So you do need to be careful about that. And the bad news is that quite often edits or system crashes can stop you from submitting the application. So you don't want to go down to the last minute any more than you wanted to go down to the last minute with paper. I have had situations where I was literally sitting like 2 minutes before the deadline trying to figure out why a field was giving me an error message that didn't give me an error message until I pressed the submit button. So be cautious of that. Kind of in that same theme, I'm seeing more of the standard portals emerging. So instead of everybody having their own little portal, we're seeing a lot of those that look very similar. And if you look at the URL for it, it's either Cyber Grants or Versaic or Foundant grant interface. You'll see those a lot. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of ability to carry things forward from one application to another. It would be nice if they were more oriented that you could create an organizational profile and then just carry it forward from application to application. I've not seen that happens yet, but at least it's a familiar format. So once you see it, you'll kind of be in familiar territory. Portals are getting more sophisticated, which is definitely good news. Just the ability to be able to save it and come back to it, that's kind of new lately. I'm seeing that more and more. You'll still see some organizations that use FormStack. Pardon my cat, he likes to help out. FormStack will force you to have everything ready to go, and you have to press submit right away or you just lose it. Some of them are getting sophisticated enough to let you have multiple users collaborate, which is very nice, kind of based on the grants.gov model. And then some are starting to pick up organizational data for you from the IRS or from something like Candid GuideStar, where you have a profile out there already. So it's getting better. And most of them will let you do a print of your application, but unfortunately, a lot of them don't let you do a full print until you get to the submit stage, which is frustrating if you're trying to make a copy for yourself or collaborate by printing copies and sharing. Some of the foundations are requiring you to have an active profile. The main one is typically Candid or GuideStar that you'll see. And then I also want to just mention that I said grants.gov already. I'm starting to see, if you know the history of grants.gov, it used to be all the agencies have their own portals or require paper. And then there was a mandate to create this grants.gov, and all agencies had to post things through grants.gov. They still have to do that as near as I can tell. And if you want to, you can subscribe to a listing of every federal grant that ever gets submitted. So you can get a daily listing of all of the grants that got submitted the day before, or the competitions that opened up the day before. But what I'm seeing is kind of a shift back where there's more what I call two-tier applications, where you submit a portion of it, and it's really a small portion of it in grants.gov. So it's just one or two forms, very basic. And that's the Mother May I that lets you get into the agency's personal portal. An example of that would be HRSA's electronic handbook that I've worked with quite a bit. And it really, literally, it's two forms. It's the SF424, which is just what's your organization name, who are your contacts, and it's the abstract. And then once you submit that, you get an invitation to finish, and all of the real work is done in electronic handbook. So my pro tip for you on that, if you find yourself in that situation, submit the grants.gov as soon as you can. Usually there's two deadlines. So there's a grants.gov deadline and then that other portal deadline. There's no reason to wait until the end of that grants.gov deadline. Do it almost immediately, because you can usually correct anything that you change later in the portal. And the more time you have to work on the actual meat of the application, the better off you're going to be. Just two other things that I will mention, and I'll turn it over to my friends here and see if they've got anything to add. One is primarily by virtue of the pandemic. Most organizations now are getting sophisticated about Zoom and Google Docs and such. So collaborating looks a little different than it used to. And it may also be a little more invasive, where you used to be able to say, sorry, I'm at home, I can't work on that right now. Not now, they're going to expect you to get on a Zoom or get on a Google Doc and make edits. So you may find that your process gets stretched out a little bit and your home life gets chipped into a little bit. And then the last one is artificial intelligence. That has really become, just in recent months, kind of the thing. And people are worrying about, is it going to take over my job? Can I use it to help me do my job more effectively? My punchline would be, jury is still out in most cases, and certainly in grant writing. And we're going to try to have a little bit of fun with that today. One of the examples, and it's probably worth a segue just to say, artificial intelligence, even though the hype is in the last few months, it's been around a long time. Anytime you got a spell checker going on, or grammar suggestions or autocorrect, anytime you get an ad served up to you because you were out on that website recently, that's all AI going on in the background. A lot of the technical support that you get, that's a chat box on a website, that's AI. So it's not really new. It's just with Chat GPT and all of the hype around it, that people are really starting to think about it in a big way. It's the virtual robot, if you will, that everybody was concerned the robots were going to take over their jobs years ago. Hasn't happened in very many industries. I will say there is a lot of potential, but it's also got a lot of limitations. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. But let me stop first of all and just ask either Kristin or Chrystie, any other trends that you want to talk about before we roll forward?
Well, no other trends, but I would like to hit on a couple of your points because they're very important. The edits and the crashes can cause you to miss deadlines. I want to reinforce that. We had several agencies in the last cycle that were not able to submit an application because they missed the deadline, and they were working on it. I could see that they were working on it like 2 minutes before the deadline date. So I would just reinforce, use a Word document, put put your narratives and your program descriptions and, you know, your need for program, put those on in a Word doc, and do the spell check, because what I'm seeing is that now that we're accepting electric applications, there are spelling errors all over the place. And nothing is worse than applying for an education grant with 20 spelling errors in it. So definitely use your spell check in the Word. Portals are getting more sophisticated. We use Community Force, and it does let you actually build a I don't want to say a profile, but it will let you import responses from prior application submissions. So if you already have a great program description, then you could just send that right to your new application. So they are making huge progress with the grant software. And then there was one more, the artificial intelligence. I would, and I'm sure you're going to go into this, Mark, but definitely read what it spits out. And I'm sure that Mark is going to go into this in his examples, but we have had some instances where people have just cut and pasted exactly what the AI has given them, and it's completely out of context. So it is a friend to you, but you have to, there still has to be that personal oversight, that human that reads it to make sure that it's in context of what's being asked.
And I'll just add one trend, and totally agree with everything you said, Chrystie. So something we've been seeing with, and it's happened with federal grants for a long time, but now we're seeing it more with private grants, private foundations, is that they're becoming more willing to provide general operating support, so not necessarily program or project specific, and interested in doing multi-year support. So that's been a really nice trend to see.
And you reminded me of something that I actually skipped over one bullet. Something that I've seen a lot since the pandemic and since Black Lives Matter and such is a real emphasis on equity. In the past, you might be asked about diversity, you might be asked about demographics, but it was kind of in passing. And there are some foundation and big foundations like Kellogg and Chrystie and others that either they have moved to a complete equity focus where that is all they grant on, or everything they grant on has a large equity component. So you're going to need to get used to answering a pretty detailed question about how, first of all, what are the inequities? How does your program address them? And you're going to be asked for things like your diversity and inclusion procedure or process, your documentation about your organization. So those are some things to be aware of as well. How do we want to proceed from here? Maybe now would be a good point to just ask if there's any questions in the queue around these trends. Ellen, are you seeing anything in the queue?
No, I'm not. Sorry, I couldn't get myself unmuted. No, we don't have any questions right now.
No problem.
I'll go to the next slide then. So please, if
Yeah,
you
go
have a
ahead.
question, just, oh wait, here's one. We do have one. Is it best to do a strategic plan first and then write your grant?
Ooh, I like that one. Yes, please. And I'll let the other two dive in as well, but that's a real hot button for me, which is why I'm jumping in. You'll hear all of us probably tell you, stick to your mission, don't chase the money. It's very important that you know what you're going to do. And I'll take it a step further to say, it's important that you know what it's going to cost to do it before you start looking for grants, because otherwise there's this tendency to say, oh, these people are giving away $50,000. These people are giving away $100,000. I could just do that. I could just do that. And A, that may not be what you're really about. And B, you're trying to then back into, well, how much can I do with that amount of money? And sometimes that works, but it often dilutes the case you're trying to make or gives you a budget that doesn't really make sense. So yeah, please, by all means, and I'll let Ellen chime in as well. I believe SCORE can help you with some of that process. Is that a true statement, Ellen?
Yes, we do. SCORE can help. We've helped several nonprofits with their strategic planning, updating it. A lot of times it seems to be forgotten. And like Mark said, when you're applying for those grants, you really need to make sure it is current. And we have a great program to help you with that.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Chrystie,
and
your-
I would like to just add that mission drift is real, and we have seen a lot of agencies that are well downriver of where their mission is supposed to be, with all of the federal and state grants that have been provided out to the community. The strategic plan is essential. You have to know what you want to do moving forward, and then go after those grants, not the other way around.
Anything, Kristin? So
I was just going to add that, I mean, a lot of times too, the funder is going to ask for a copy of your strategic plan. So you want to make sure that not only is it helping guide what you're doing, but that it's in a presentable state so you can submit it along with your application.
Yep.
And we
go ahead.
That's very important. United Way asks for the strategic plan from all of our organizations, and I will hear a lot of times, oh my gosh, we're going to have to get the board together and we're going to have to, update our strategic plan. Well, the strategic plan should be updated on a regular basis. It's not something that you just go through and then put the binder on the shelf. You need to have it ready and able to present, because a lot of grantors will only give you a finite window, 2 weeks or a month, to submit that application. And it's not enough time to convene your board, create a strategic plan, update your bylaws, and, get all of that stuff done.
Chrystie, what's the other spell check system you said you use besides like Microsoft Word? Did you mention another one?
No, I spell check in Microsoft Word.
Right. Okay. And any document, like even like Google Docs or whatever you're using, will have some kind of, and then Grammarly also, you can use that, and that they give nonprofits no cost to use that as well, and then it'll be free. So those are two that do spell check,
and it is well worth, if you don't have it, to get it for the grants. A lot of the federal grants, if they see, if there are mistakes in it, then they're crumpling it up. It's going into the circular file. It's not going to be making it through the process.
Okay, great. So that's all the questions we've got for now. And I'll go to the next slide, Mark.
Okay. So this is one of the questions that we received ahead of time. Thank you for those who did submit early. We're going to play with this one a little bit. Before we do, I want to make one more point about what we were just talking about. And there's also one other question that I want to address kind of upfront for folks. As far as talking about the strategic plan, the same is absolutely true about all of your financial documents and budget in particular. So don't let that process fall by the wayside either. I've had clients, it tends to be more around the beginning of the year, but depending on how large the client is, you may not have a current active, accurate budget. And that's something you're almost always going to be asked for in a grant application. So you need to have that up to date and ready to grab. The other question that I wanted to mention before we got started here, Ellen said that a few folks were asking if they're from a for-profit organization. Do the kinds of things we're talking about here apply to for-profits as well? I'll answer that kind of two ways, and then I'll let my friends here answer what they would like to as well. But I would say, first of all, if you're at a point where you are able to apply for a grant, yes, everything we're telling you here will apply to the process of filling out a grant application. So that for sure. But the other side of it, that is, will I, as a for-profit, be eligible to apply for a grant? And my answer would be there are not a lot of grants that I encounter that are for-profit companies. Most of them are for nonprofits, but there are two gray areas around that. One is we're starting to see the socially conscious for-profits. If you happen to fall into that category, you know what I'm talking about. You may see some foundations that are willing to take an application from a for-profit that can prove that it is socially conscious. But the other one that's going to be much more common is even if you're not eligible to be the applicant, you can still collaborate with others. So you would have to find a partner who is a nonprofit, and then you would basically get a sub-grant from them or contribute in some way to the grant where you're getting some money through them, but the actual money would come through the applicant, and the applicant would be the one that does all the paperwork and signs everything. Anything you two want to add to that?
No, we are seeing more and more for-profits participating in the granting process, but it is always through a collaboration where they may or may not be the backbone agency. But I would think it would be more beneficial to get a nonprofit partner to apply for the grant and then create a MOA or a memorandum of understanding or agreement.
There's a question that I was going to answer it, but I'm going to have you all answer it. Are 501(c)(3)s needed for nonprofit grants? Because usually that's part of the application process is a copy of your 501(c)(3). Right.
I'll give you a yes and to that one as well. Definitely, they will ask you for your IRS determination letter, and the ideal is that you are already a registered nonprofit, but there's also such a thing as a fiscal agent. And if you're a nonprofit organization that has not yet gotten the IRS determination, it is possible to work with someone who basically manages the finances of your grant for you and provides the oversight. My own experience, Community Foundation of the Lowcountry has acted in that capacity for a couple of clients of mine. So if you're just getting started, and even if you have your 501(c)(3), but you don't have a lot of experience or any experience managing the grant funds, it's not a bad idea to touch bases with someone like that and see if they're willing to be the applicant, and to do that usually for a very small fee. They will manage the funds for that grant.
Okay, great. Let's see, we have another question. I just started my nonprofit last year and I just recently got my 501(c)(3) status. Would it be best practice to apply for grants now with me just starting, or should I wait until I've actively done more and show that I'm an active nonprofit?
I can take a shot at that, but I'd rather have the two of you first, since you have more. Chrystie in particular, what's your orientation towards new nonprofits?
Well, it really depends on the kind of grant. If the grant is outcomes based, then you're going to have some outcomes to provide, which means the program has to be ongoing, has to be running. So it really actually depends on how it is. If it's for a new innovative program, then you don't need to have the outcomes already established. You can have what you think is going to be the outcomes. But it really just depends on the grantor and what their focus is for the grant funding.
Okay, and then one more question about that. Someone is just starting out, they're waiting back for their 501(c). We submitted back in March. Should we go ahead and start applying for grants even though we're in waiting?
Nope. I would wait until you actually get it, because until you know you've been approved, you could be doing a whole lot of work on a grant that you're not eligible for until you know that you have the 501(c)(3) status.
I will say some foundations in their eligibility requirements that they will speak to that and say, whether or not they will allow somebody who's got an application in for that. The fiscal agent that I mentioned previously is a way to end run that. If everything is a go for a grant, if you need it, yeah, you're eligible for it. You just don't have that 501c3 designation. That's kind of a way to do that. Before we dive into more questions, just a couple other things on these last two that I wanted to mention. For a new nonprofit, even if your nonprofit is new, your staff probably has experience. So when you get a question about experience, you may not have to walk away from the grant because your new nonprofit has not done that before. If you've got people on your staff who have done it before, and you can make a good case that way, sometimes you can kind of get around that. The other thing I was going to say is it's in your best interest to start small. So if you are a new nonprofit, getting a couple of grants in the $1,000, $2,000 range proves that you can manage the funds properly. And then you get a little street cred there and you can start to build on that. So don't dive in and apply for $150,000 if you're a brand new, especially if they ask for your budget and your budget says you've never had $150,000 to work with in the past. They're very unlikely to give it to you. But if you can show that you've gotten a few smaller grants, that helps. And then the last plug I want to make, again, the community foundations are a wonderful exception in my experience, that most of the places you apply for, like the big federal grants, they are looking for an excuse to stop reading your application because they get so many more applications than they can fund. The minute you do something wrong or don't pay attention to, and it can be as stupid as they say, do it in Times New Roman font 12 point and you use 10 point. Some will throw it out for that. And for good reason, because they literally sometimes get 10 or 20 times as many applications as they can afford to fund. So they just don't want to deal with them. But community foundations are on the opposite end of that spectrum. Everyone that I have ever worked with, if they want to give you money, they will go out of their way to help you put together an effective application that is something that is in the range of what they fund. It may mean, because they like to say yes, it may mean you don't get everything you ask for. Sometimes they will give you a smaller award so they can still say yes, even though you asked for 20, they might give you 10, that kind of thing. Or they may give conditions. So they may say, you asked for 20, you can have 10 up front. And if you do these 3 things you said you would do, then you can get the other 10. But they are a great place to start, and they will, unlike most agencies where they try to be the man behind the curtain and you never get to talk to a real person and they don't want to know who you are. The community foundations will ask you to come in, they'll give you training, they'll sit down with you, they'll offer to go over your application before you submit it quite often. So definitely start there. That's a great place. All right. Anything else for us, Ellen, before I go on to this question?
Yes, we got all kinds. So somebody's asking, would like community organizations, can you specify that a little bit clearer? Like what do you mean?
Yeah, sure. If you're not familiar with the term, almost all cities or counties or regions, depending on how big each of those are, relatively speaking, have some sort of community foundation. So if you just go into Google and say community foundation and put your city or your county in there, you'll probably find that there is a community foundation that serves your area. And what they are, often they come from, like I've seen a lot that came from the sale of hospitals, where the profits from selling that hospital were then rolled into a fund that this community foundation manages as a way to help the community ongoing because that hospital is no longer there. And so, like I say, almost every city, region, county has somebody that serves them. For us, there is Community Foundation of the Lowcountry that I mentioned. There's also the Coastal Community Foundation. And by us, I mean Charleston, Beaufort area there. But across the state, there are certainly others. And they are definitely worth looking up and talking to.
Okay, you want to do this slide and then we'll go to the questions we have after that. Because I want to get this slide in.
Yeah, you folks have been staring at this question for a while. So
Yeah.
this is one that came in that there were a few that were asking about kind of, I'm new to grant writing. And we had done a presentation, actually, at least the last 2 years that I'm aware of, that was an actual grant writing 101 kind of presentation. So I'm going to provide some slides here that speak specifically to this question, but I also wanted to have a little bit of fun with it in that trends and AI leg there. So what I'm going to do is you take this question. It says, I'm new to grant writing and I'm really interested in learning how we should tell our story in a grant and also how to create accurate goals to accomplish for a grant project. And I'm going to ask Bing, one of the AIs that's available to everybody, this question. So if we go to the next slide here, we can see this is what Bing had to say. It's actually not a bad answer. Starting off here, it says, to tell your story in a grant, you should focus on the impact your project will have on the community and the people it serves. Be sure to highlight the problem you're trying to solve, why it is important, and how your project will address it. You should also include information about your organization's history, missions, and values. That's all good stuff. And then they go into SMART goals, which I was going to talk about anyway. So thank you, Bing. You beat me to that one. And then there's even some shameless promotion on the bottom for Lowcountry Score and their nonprofit series. Now, let's pick at this a little bit so you can kind of understand what you're looking at. First of all, why is there a shameless promotion for Lowcountry Score? why did Bing know that that would come into play? Well, if you look at the very bottom right there, you notice it says 13 of 30. So this was a conversation that I had been having with Bing. And prior to asking this question, I had been testing it out a little bit. One of the things I asked it was, what is the Lowcountry Score's mission? And by the way, it did a good job of going out and stripping that off the website, coming back and telling me what is the mission. But it remembered that. So now as I'm asking questions, you'll notice it said on the top, searching for Lowcountry Score grant writing research assistance. It remembered it, assumed I still was interested in coming at it from that tack, and that's why that got ended up in there. Same for the SMART goals, because I was going to talk about SMART goals and I wanted to make sure I was remembering what all the letters stood for. So I had done a search that said, what does SMART goal stand for? And sure enough, now it remembered that and carried it forward. So that's kind of a good news, bad news thing with working with the AI, is that it will remember what you asked in the past. So that means you don't necessarily have to keep repeating yourself. But it also means sometimes it'll carry things forward or give you a very limited focus when that's not what you meant. And I'm going to show you a good example of that as we move forward a little bit later. So let me, unless either of you two, Kristin or Chrystie, anything just on this before we go into the other slides?
Nope.
Okay. Ian head shakes. Ellen, if you want to advance us to the next one. So these are some slides that we put together, again, for that Grants 101 presentation. And I think Chrystie may have created this one originally, and then Kristin spoke to it last year because Chrystie got COVID right before the presentation. But anyhow, it breaks down kind of what's in a typical proposal. You'll find if you're doing a purely online application, a lot of these will just be questions in that application. But if you're doing something that's more like a federal grant where they ask you to create and attach a proposal, you're going to see all of these sections show up in the proposal. So again, you'll get copies of these slides. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but just to give you a feel, there's going to be usually an executive summary. You're going to talk about your need. You're going to talk about your program and how it addresses that need. You're going to talk about outcomes and evaluation, which basically means how can you tell that you were successful? So what are the measures and how are you going to measure them? The budget, you'll find as I talk in future slides, I don't put the budget at the bottom, I put it at the top, but usually in the flow of things, it is towards the bottom. And then supporting materials. They're always going to ask you to attach things, and we've talked about some already, but you see things there like a list of your board members. If you file 990s, they're going to ask for your most recent 990 filing with the IRS. They'll ask for your budgets, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next slide, Ellen, if you will. Oh, she's being all fancy here. So here's the SMART goal again with a little more detail for those of you who haven't worked with them before. The basic gist for me is that a goal, if it's just really generic and if it doesn't have any measures in it, is not, first of all, you can't tell whether you were successful, but it's also not going to impress anybody who's reading your grant application. So you really want to be specific. You want to make sure it has a measure in it and a target. And you want to make sure that that target is something that you can reasonably do. And it's reasonably do based on your experience. It's reasonably do based on how much money you're asking for, reasonably do based on the approach that you've said you're going to use to solve the problem. And then the final one is time bound. So it's not just we're going to help 100 people, period. It's we're going to help 100 people do this by this date. That's kind of smart. And hopefully most of you have run into that before in the past, but do when you get all done with your application, if you're looking at your goals, go back and look and just say, hey, did I hit all those? Because it will help strengthen things a lot. Ellen, you want to hit the next slide? So this is talking about budget here. And again, a slide that I think Chrystie created and then Kristin spoke to last time. But this will talk through a little bit about how to create your budget. It is a story in itself. So I like the fact that the question was kind of worded that way, that you're telling a story with your budget and you're justifying your costs as you're going along. And it needs to sync up with your narrative. It needs to sync up with your abstract. So that's why when I say I like to put the budget first, it's really easy to create your narrative, well, even starting back from that. If you create your abstract first, say, this is what we're going to do, and it's a couple paragraphs, it's really, really catchy. And then you start writing your narrative, and all of a sudden you're doing this and you're doing that. And now when you go back and look at your abstract, it doesn't really match your narrative anymore. Even worse is when you do all these, you said, I'm going to do all these things in the narrative, and now you start working on your budget, like, oh, I don't know that I can really afford to do all that. So I'll just do these three things. Or you say in your narrative, we want this many dollars of this many dollars of this, and you get into your budget like, oh no, we got to tweak that. And all of a sudden they're out of sync. And reviewers will see that and they'll say, these folks don't know what they're doing. I understand how that happens, and quite often it's people who absolutely know what they're doing. But to the reviewer's eye, it's a big red flag. It says, no, these things don't sync up. They don't really know what they're doing. So be very careful of that. Chrystie or Kristin, anything you want to talk to about budget specifically?
We have can I insert a question here that maybe ladies could answer that we have specifically about budgets? How can newer, smaller nonprofits combat the quote unquote overhead restrictions?
I would love to speak to that. So in most cases, when I'm reviewing organizations 990s, when they are applying to United Way, the biggest issue that I see is that they don't know how to allocate program costs accurately, and a lot of the program costs gets dumped into the admin and general line items. So your executive director, their salary, 100% of their salary should not be in admin and overhead, because that executive director is needed to run those programs or to provide the leadership for the organization. So a portion of your executive director's salary should be put into program costs. A portion of your finance person should be put into program costs, especially if you're like an emergency service provider, because without the finance person, you're not cutting checks. So what I see most often is just the resources that an organization has, they're not allocated properly. They're dumped into admin and general line item, which creates the high overhead. Another way to really lower that overhead is to figure out how to use volunteers. With volunteer hours or in-kind contributions, they can really lower your overhead percentage, especially when it comes to the salary line items.
And I think another trend that we're seeing too is more conversation around this issue and the understanding that Yes, absolutely. Like most of our funding and support should be going toward programs and services, but recognizing that many nonprofits really starve themselves on the administrative side. And so then they're really not able to be good stewards of the funding. So it's a really important balance to find, and a lot more funders are willing to have that conversation and actually help fund some of those costs as well.
Yeah, I'll support Kristin and say that United Way, we're looking at, we have a 30% overhead requirement, no higher. But we really are looking at that because, you know, some of us are tasked with some of the hardest issues to solve in the world, hunger and, you know, homelessness, and yet we're starving the administrative staff in order to make that happen. So we are also reviewing that overhead requirement to see if it's still advantageous for us to keep.
That makes me think of two things that are worth mentioning. If you're a very new nonprofit, especially if you're kind of a nonprofit of one, bear in mind that nonprofit does not mean all volunteer. You are allowed to take a salary. I have seen so many people that they go out and they get grants for programs that they want to do. And at best, you know, they may give themselves a slice to administer that program, but they're not drawing any kind of salary out of their own nonprofit. And I understand the mentality there, but you need to be able to take care of yourself because that shows up when we start talking about sustainability. If an organization wants to fund you and they're looking at you and saying, you don't pay yourself, what happens if you're not there anymore? Or what, you know, when you need to start doing things to cover your family's expenses, what happens to this organization? So go ahead and draw a reasonable salary, but draw a salary. And if you're not drawing a salary, keep track of your time and put your time in as an in-kind contribution. Chrystie talked about that. You want that in your budget. So a lot of people just think, oh, it's in kind, so I don't account for it. No, you want to account for it. There are websites out there where you can look to see what an average cost would be for somebody if you were paying them to do whatever your volunteer is doing. Use that as a basis to say, we got 150 volunteer hours at $24 an hour, and that should be a line item budget that shows up so that when somebody looks at what your organization does, they don't just see how the money goes out, they see what's being contributed as well.
Right. And to Mark's point, you know, those in-kind contributions can be significant, especially if you have a lot of volunteers, or if you're getting a lot of product, whatever that is, from an organization that's just donating. And something else that it does is when we circle back to the slide of telling your story, it tells the grantor that there's community support for your program. So by leaving those numbers out, it actually handicaps you and doesn't truly tell your story because they don't see all the community support that you have through volunteers and through in-kind contributions. So you're kind of hiding your light under a bushel basket.
What's a question just popped up. How do you determine what a reasonable salary would be?
That's hard because the agencies that apply to me, I see all ends of the spectrum. As Mark stated, a nonprofit of one, I know several of those, and all the way up to, you know, a corporate nonprofit. So it really depends on the salaries of the other employees and the size of the budget, the amount of money you have running through your budget. But to reinforce what Mark had stated, it is important to have a salary in there, because if I don't see a salary when I'm reviewing a budget, if that executive director got hit by a bus tomorrow, this program is not happening, because it's very hard to find another person to slide in free of charge to run that organization. And it does go to the sustainability of the organization. So make sure that you're putting something in there, or that you're putting it in as an in-kind contribution so that it is visible in your budget.
I'm just going to add on to that. And there are salary surveys that you can get access to either through like Together SC, for example, or other statewide or national membership organizations. But you can also do your own research by going to Candid and looking at organizations 990s, finding folks who are similar to you and kind of using that to help compare. And of course, you know, looking for folks with, like Chrystie was saying, similar budget sizes, similar missions, ideally geographically similar too, is helpful. So there are some tools out there you can use to help make those determinations. And also, of course, just should go without saying, when you're taking your salary, of course, everything needs to be approved by your board. If you're the executive director, right, you're not just going to decide in a vacuum. So just be sure too that you're doing everything on the up and up, and you might be taking the suggestion to the board, like this is the salary surveys, this is what the research I've done, this is what seems to be a reasonable salary, but put it on your board. Board has to decide, has to be reflected in the minutes, because you're going to need to be able to back that up and show that that was approved and not something that you just decided to do on your own.
And that's another thing that I've seen with new nonprofits. You need a board. You cannot be the board as well as the executive director. And there is a difference between a board of directors and an advisory board. Advisory boards typically are very community heavy. They're the ones who are going to help you decide what to work on and how to approach the problem. But your board of directors is who you report to if you have a nonprofit. So it cannot be you. You can't be signing your own paychecks. And that's going to be a huge red flag for anybody who's looking at your organization to see if you're viable or not.
Okay, great. Because there's a question on that. How does the composition of a board impact getting a grant funding?
Well, you shouldn't be shouldn't be compensating the board. Was that the question?
No, the composition, what the makeup of the
Oh,
board.
the composition.
Yes, composition. How does having a board or not having a board, how does that impact getting grant funding?
It's going to impact it significantly. Like Mark said, if you are the board and the executive director, then you don't have a group of individuals. You don't have different lenses that you're looking at a situation through. And the board provides the governance. The executive director make sure that they follow through, the staff and the organization follow through on the governance that the board creates. So it is essential to have a board of directors. And with our process, we won't fund you if you don't have a board of directors.
And then Mark, what was the name of the title of the person who can help manage grant funds coming in that you mentioned at the beginning?
A fiscal agent.
Fiscal agent. Okay. Perfect. That was okay. And then we've got a few more questions, but they'll kind of go to the next slide.
You can roll the next slide if you want.
So we'll do that. We'll talk about telling. I'm going to go ahead and ask this question first. When writing, let's see. Wait, sorry, there's so many questions here. What type of write-up or formal documentation is needed to show what programs the nonprofit actively has in order to seek funding via grants?
Chrystie or Kristin?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, typically it's just you reporting out in the grant application what programs and services you're providing, and talking about the longevity, talking about how many people you helped or animals or whatever you've helped in the situation. So there doesn't necessarily need to be like third-party documentation, but of course, as you're around longer, then you'll have more of that other documentation through your 990s and your audits and all of that good stuff as well.
So when writing a proposal for a future program project, do grants have stipulations on how far out the program has to be completed by? do they penalize you if the program doesn't come to foresight by the given deadline?
Some may. Once again, you're going to hear this a lot, I think, throughout the presentation. It really depends on the grantor, and who is funding, who are you seeking funding from? Because United Way, we don't penalize you. We ask, what are the outcomes of your program, and did you experience any barriers that prevented you from achieving your goals? But we're not going to penalize you. We're actually going to look at those and say, okay, well, maybe we need to change up the program a little bit. Maybe we need to do some tweaks here or there to make sure that the program is efficient and effective.
I want to build on that because I can use a real life example that involves Chrystie and United Way and the slide. So, the middle part talking about the project as a mutually beneficial partnership. And it's not just talking about it, but realizing that you do have a partnership with the grantor, and Hopeful Horizons is lucky enough to receive funding from United Way of the Lowcountry. And we got some new funding that came into play right before the pandemic, and we hadn't been able to get those programs off the ground because of the pandemic. And Chrystie and I've had ongoing conversations, stayed in touch about what we can do to move things forward, and slowly but surely things are finally moving forward. But it's been a few years since we applied for that funding, and fortunately they're one of the funders who has flexibility around that and is really a good partner and wants to help. Most all of your funders want to be your partner and help you succeed. So, and they'll all have different kind of guidelines around that.
Right. And in my experience, I've seen some of the federal grants, they will come back to you. If you don't do what you say you're going to do, they will come back for those funds that they distributed. So that's why the slide that we were talking about, those SMART goals, is really important, because you need to know the product that you're providing and how to measure it, so that on the tail end you can give feedback back to the grantor, so that you have fulfilled the requirements of the grant that you applied for.
I want to get to these other questions just since we're almost coming up on an hour.
Ellen, if I can for just a second, there's two things there that are probably worth just a moment or two to touch on. One is reporting and the other is transparency. Any grant that you get that's more than like $1,000, you're going to be asked to do not only an end of project report, but probably a middle of project report, maybe quarterly, it may be mid-year. So they're going to be wanting to know how it's going. And if you're off track, they're going to want to know how you're going to get back on track. It is possible sometimes to get an extension to a grant. I have done that a few times. You kind of go in there with your tail between your legs and say, we're not going to get it done. Is it possible for us to have longer to do it? If you have been doing the reporting, if you have been transparent about things, then they're probably going to be open to that. But you never, ever want to surprise your funder with bad news. If anything is looking like it's not going the way you want it to go, don't wait for that quarterly report or whatever. Get on the phone with them, drop them an email, say, hey, just wanted you to know this happened. We're working on it. We're going to try to get back on track, but wanted you to have it on your radar. It makes a huge difference if you do end up having to come back for a request, like give me another year to finish this grant. That kind of thing. Go ahead, Ellen. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. So 2 questions from the same person about when applying for a grant, do you ever get feedback from, like, if you were denied a grant? Do some of the people who read the applications, like Chrystie, do you give feedback on why somebody didn't get a grant?
Yeah, we do. And once again, it depends on the grantor, and it depends on the process. If there is a feedback, if feedback is built into the process, a lot of the federal and state grants will not give you feedback as to why your grant didn't proceed. But I think more of the local funders tend to provide that feedback. I give any agency that doesn't make it through our process or doesn't receive funding can can schedule an appointment with me, and we go page by page through the application, and I let them know where they might have left some points on the table, how to better phrase it, or how to make it more clear. And I let them know what the volunteers' feedback is. We ask the volunteers that read the applications to provide us with feedback on the application so that we can give it back to the individual, because we want you guys to be successful. And that just, the more successful you are, the more successful our outcomes are that we present. So we want you guys to be successful.
Okay, great. And then what about finding grant writers?
I'll let Kristin talk to that one.
Well, and of course we have one with us today, but yeah, I mean, they're out there. Mark is not the only one. There are other consultants and other folks out in the community. And, you know, now that we can do things remotely, Hopeful Horizons actually works with a contract grant writer out of Columbia, South Carolina. So, so they're out there, and I think you just need to, again, you can do a Google search, and it's important for you to meet with the people, talk to them, you know, find out if it's a good fit. So they're out there.
And then as far as searching for grants, where can we find private funding grants for nonprofits? Private funding. Yes.
Do you want to, there's a slide that has some resources on it.
Yeah, there's a slide, yes, that does. And then also, with there being so many grants out there, how can you filter the grants when applying to find those that are more beneficial for your program? There's also a slide for that too. So,
well, I will express my frustration with that. Of all the things that I do, that is the one that frustrates me the most, because I feel like I spend so much time on it and have so little to show for it. There are tools out there, Grant Station, Foundation Directory online, that are databases of foundations. And of those two that I mentioned, I like Foundation Directory better because it gives profiles that, among other things, show how much funding they've given in the past 5 years to your state. It's got a little bit more of a feel for where the actual money is going, whereas Grant Station is based just on profiles that the foundations themselves create and maintain. So it tells you what they say they're going to fund, and that's good to know. But it doesn't necessarily tell you where their money has been going. And sometimes those don't sync up completely, or they say they're a federal program, but if you look at where they funded, they really only focus on one particular region of the country or something like that. The challenge really is in searches, it seems to be feast or famine. Either you'll do a search that's really specific and you'll get nothing back, or you'll do one that's more general and you'll get dozens of responses. And then going through them, I find quite often, why did this show up in my search results? It doesn't make sense. So you can pay somebody like me to do that sifting, but I always feel bad charging clients for that because it is so time intensive. That's my bad news there. Also, just kind of speaking to the grant writing in general, one thing you want to be aware of is that you typically cannot charge your time, your own time, or somebody you pay to write a grant to that grant. Most grants will say that any cost in your budget has to be as of the date of your award. So you're kind of on your own. And when Kristin was talking earlier about general operating funds, and we've also talked about sustainability plans, sometimes you can build yourself some money into a grant that's either for general operating funds or to sustain something that you're getting funded by somebody else, have money to apply for future grants or to search for other funding opportunities. So that's a good way to kind of sneak some money in the door, other than having to ask, for your board to give you money to either to fund your time to go do the grant research yourself, or to pay somebody to do the grant research or the grant writing.
okay, great. We'll just let's kind of fly through these last few slides you've got, and then we'll wrap up and be done. How about that?
Go for it. So on this one, we're just basically talking about what makes a proposal attractive. I think what I'll highlight here is just when you're giving demographics, don't talk about the nation, don't talk about the state unless you serve the whole state. Talk about your community. Try to support your data with actual sources like the U.S. Census, like Kids Count. Just to anecdotally say, we have a real problem with homelessness in our community doesn't mean anything to a reviewer. That's just an opinion. That's not data. When you're picking your solution, you're always walking a balance between saying, what I'm doing is innovative, because usually they say they want something that's innovative, but also that it's proven. And one way to walk that balance is to look at who has done this elsewhere that you can say, see, it works here, but I'm going to bring it to my community. And then something that makes grants attractive, especially to private corporate sponsors, is make sure you offer to give credit. So, you know, if they sponsor your event, make sure you're putting their logo on your website when you promote the event, and giving them credit in your Facebook page when you post photos of the event and how it went, things like that. Also, very important to collaborate these days. You need to show an awareness of who else does what you're saying you're going to do, who else speaks to that community or that need, and how you're working with them as opposed to just duplicating what they do. And that's probably it for this slide, unless anybody has anything to add.
Well, that duplication of services is very important, because what we see is we see a whole lot of nonprofits. Just in Beaufort County, there are over 1,600 nonprofits operating. So we want to know, as a grantor, that you've done your research, that you're not creating a whole new wheel when there's a wheel already out there, that you're actually hitching your horse to that cart, instead of creating a whole new situation or agency, because these systemic issues that nonprofits are charged with helping are huge, and they take individuals from all different walks of life and to help fill, to solve these problems. So
Ellen, just to speak to this question that's on the screen here, the gist of it is, tell me about the process. So the next couple slides here are, again, from our Grants 101, talking about process, if you want to go ahead and advance to that. First of all, I did ask Bing, again, I promised we would try to get our AI involved here. And it gives a pretty decent answer. I'm not going to read that all to you, but I think probably the question really is focused on Bing's bullet 4 there about writing the proposal itself. So the next couple of slides, we'll talk about what's the best process to write the proposal. Go ahead and shoot us forward, Ellen. So this slide actually contains 2 answers to that question, depending on how you want to look at it. This is me speaking as a professional grant writer. This is my process whenever I tackle a new grant. Very first thing I do is read the instructions. You'll notice I've capitalized that. You'll hear us all harp about that. That's going to make or break your application. It starts very early in the process, because if you don't meet the eligibility criteria, you're wasting your time even completing an application. But also, again, we've talked about how some of the federal grants are somebody big, like a Gates Foundation. They get so many applications. If you don't follow their instructions to the letter, they're going to throw you out. They're not going to waste time reading your application. What I'm looking for as I'm reading the application, I'm also kind of flagging what I call critical path items. So what are things that are going to take extra time or are going to require somebody else's input that I don't have control over? So what do I need signatures on, approvals of? Who do I need letters of support from? What kind of plans might I need? Does it require public notice that I'm applying for it? Some grants do, usually federal grants. Then the next thing I would go to is objectives and measures. What are you going to do? How are you going to know if you're successful? We talked about that before. So that's your goals. And then your budget. Based on what I say I want to do, what's it going to cost me to do that? Then I'm going to roll into the big narrative and the budget justification, which is just if you're asked for a budget justification, it's a narrative that talks about your budget and ties it to your project narrative. Then I'm going to do my timeline. If they ask you for what are you going to do in what order, that's when I do that. Then I work on my forms and attachments. And the very last thing I do is create the abstract, because it literally should be a summary of everything else you've done.
The only thing that I would add is in between of that hit submit button, take your grant proposal and give it to somebody that doesn't live in your nonprofit forest, right? Give it to a friend, a family member, somebody that does not do what you're doing, because so often we'll get grant proposals and they're not explicit. They're not clear. They just take for granted that we know who that organization is and what that organization does. But if you take somebody that doesn't live in your forest and ask them to review the application, then they could ask you those questions. Well, I was a little unclear as to what the organization does, or I was a little unclear as to the process. And they will give you some great pointers as to what was clear and what wasn't clear in your application.
Okay.
No, we're getting close on time. How do you want to handle things?
I think we'll go ahead and wrap up, since it's almost 10 after, but because everybody will be getting these slides, let's just go to these last ones here about, just the resources. I think this is important. These last couple of marks. You want to talk about
this one here was just, I had asked Bing the question, he didn't know. But the answer is the state library does offer access to Foundation Directory online. The caveat being you have to physically go there, but if you happen to live somewhere near Columbia and the state library, you can go there and use their data search tool. That's all on that one.
Perfect.
And then again, these are just some potential places to look for grant opportunities. We've touched on several of them already. Of course, we have United Way on the call here, so she's talked a bit about that. I think that's probably good for that one.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending today. We appreciate all your questions and everything. Again, you will be receiving the recording plus the slides. And I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to thank Coastal States Bank again. And then this is the rest of the nonprofit series. So next week we'll talk about fundraising strategies with two of their co-workers, Aaron Hall and Wendy Jones will be there. So, and this just has a mind of its own. But anyway, next Tuesday for Halloween, I think Aaron and Wendy may be dressed up. I don't know. So that should be good. And then Coastal States will be presenting the last one to talk about banking products for nonprofits. And if you are in need of a mentor, please go to the website listed on all the slides and all the information, fill out the application, fill out the little form and say you're a nonprofit and need help with your strategic planning, and we can do that for you. So everybody have a fantastic day. Thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions.
Bye. Great questions, y'all.